Good evening, dear wanderer, and welcome to this gentle hour, when the day folds its golden wings and settles into the peaceful embrace of twilight. Tonight we step away from the hurried pace of modern life, away from the bright screens and endless notifications, and drift instead towards something older, something that moves with the rhythm of seasons turning, of seeds sprouting, of the eternal dance between earth and sky. Find your most comfortable place tonight, perhaps by a window where the last light of evening filters through, perhaps wrapped in your softest blanket, with something warm cooling gently in your hands. And if it brings you comfort, let me know in your thoughts, where you're listening from, what time it is in your corner of this vast world. There's something deeply soothing about knowing that others are settling into the same ancient rhythms, the same gentle stories that have whispered souls to peaceful rest for countless generations. So close your eyes if you wish, let your breathing slow to match the cadence of these words, steady and warm like the pulse of life itself rising from rich dark soil. And let's begin with what the Greeks believed happened long ago, when the world was young, and the gods were just learning to shape their gifts from starlight and intention. Tonight we tell the story of Demeter, goddess of the harvest, mother of growing things, protector of those who work the earth with patient hands and loving hearts. She is gentle and fierce, nurturing and protective, a goddess who understood that life itself depends on the delicate balance between giving and receiving, between the seeds we plant and the care we offer to help them grow. But her story begins not in golden wheat fields or abundant orchards, not in the green valleys, where she would later walk, blessing every growing thing with her divine touch, but in the same dark place where all the Olympian tales begin, in the belly of a Titan who feared his own children more than he feared the judgment of eternity itself. Demeter was the second child born to Kronos and Rhea, coming into the world after gentle Hestia, and before the others who would one day rule from golden thrones on high Olympus. From the moment of her birth, there was something different about her, something that spoke of deep connection to the living earth, to the ancient cycles that governed all growing things. The poets tell us that even as an infant, before she was swallowed by her fearful father, Demeter's presence made flowers bloom more brightly, made the grass grow greener beneath her tiny feet, made the very air smell of spring mornings and new possibilities. She carried within her even then the promise of abundance, the understanding that life seeks always to multiply, to flourish, to share its gifts with generous hands. But like her siblings before her, tiny Demeter disappeared into the terrible darkness of Kronos' fear, swallowed whole before she could speak her first word, before she could take her first steps across the earth she was destined to bless. There in that primordial darkness she waited, growing not just in size but in wisdom, in understanding of what it meant to be separated from the world of light and growth. Yet even in that dark place, Demeter's divine nature could not be contained. The myths whisper that her presence within Kronos caused him strange dreams, visions of endless harvests, a field so rich and abundant that their golden waves stretched beyond any horizon he could imagine. Sometimes he would wake with the taste of honey and grain on his lips, with the scent of wildflowers lingering in his ancient nostrils. These dreams troubled the Titan king, for they spoke of a power he did not understand, a force that seemed to promise abundance rather than threat, growth rather than destruction. In his paranoid mind, he could not comprehend that one of his swallowed children might represent creation rather than conquest, that divine power might manifest as generosity rather than dominance. And so Demeter remained imprisoned, along with her siblings, learning patience in darkness, understanding the deep rhythms that would later make her the most beloved of all the harvest goddesses. She learned to feel the slow pulse of life even in the absence of light, to understand that growth sometimes requires periods of waiting, of gathering strength in hidden places before bursting forth into the world. When Zeus finally came of age and tricked Kronos into releasing his siblings, Demeter emerged not as the tiny infant who had been swallowed, but as a fully grown goddess whose very presence made the earth around her burst into bloom. The first place her feet touched after her liberation became a meadow so beautiful, so rich with flowers and grain, that mortals would later build temples there, hoping to capture some of her blessing for their own fields. Her liberation was like the first day of spring after the longest winter, like the moment when seeds that have lain dormant in frozen soil suddenly feel the warmth of sun and decide to reach toward light. The other gods, emerging one by one from their father's belly, paused in wonder at the transformation that followed in Demeter's footsteps, the way barren stone became fertile earth, the way even the air seemed to shimmer with the promise of harvest. Zeus, looking upon his sister with the eyes of someone who had learned to recognize power in all its forms, understood immediately that Demeter would be essential to the new order they were about to create. A realm of gods, no matter how magnificent, would mean nothing if the mortal world below could not sustain life, could not feed the creatures who would look to Olympus for guidance and blessing. And Demeter, stretching her divine limbs for the first time in centuries, feeling the earth respond to her presence with eager joy, understood that her long imprisonment had not been wasted time but preparation. She had learned, in that dark place, what it meant to hunger for light, to yearn for growth, to understand the deep patience required for any seed to become the harvest it was meant to be. The great war against the Titans that followed was fought not just with thunderbolts and earthquakes, but with the promise of abundance, with Demeter's gift of showing the world what it could become when tended with divine care. While Zeus hurled lightning and Poseidon shook the foundations of the earth, Demeter caused grain to grow in impossible places, fed the armies of the new gods with bread that never diminished, gave them strength drawn from the deepest sources of life itself. And when victory was finally achieved, when the old order had been overthrown and the new cosmos was ready to be born, Demeter claimed her domain not through conquest but through the simple act of kneeling in a field and placing her hands upon the soil. The earth recognized her touch immediately, responding with such joy and abundance that the very stones cracked open to release springs of fresh water, that trees bent their branches low to offer fruit to any who might be hungry. Sleep now, gentle listener, and dream of that first moment when the earth awakened to divine blessing, when fields that had known only wildness learned the joy of cultivation, when the ancient partnership between human hands and divine grace first began. Rest knowing that somewhere in every seed lies the memory of that first awakening, the promise that abundance is possible when we tend our gardens with patience and love. Tomorrow, or perhaps in another dream, we'll follow Demeter as she learns to walk the mortal world, teaching the first farmers their sacred craft, discovering what it means to be a goddess whose greatest joy comes not from being worshipped, but from seeing the fruits of her care flourish in countless fields under countless skies. The night deepens gently around us, dear listener, and in this peaceful hour we continue our journey with Demeter, no longer the imprisoned goddess waiting in darkness, but now the divine guardian of all growing things, stepping for the first time onto the earth she was born to bless. Let your breathing settle into the rhythm of these words, slow and steady like rain falling on fertile soil, and picture, if you will, a world still learning what abundance could mean, a place where mortals had only begun to understand that the earth beneath their feet held promises more magnificent than any treasure buried in distant mountains. The early years after the Titanomachy, that great war that reshaped the cosmos itself, were years of discovery for all the Olympian gods. Zeus was learning to rule the heavens without destroying what he sought to protect. Poseidon was discovering the moods of his vast oceanic realm, and Hades was establishing order in the mysterious depths below. But perhaps no god faced a challenge quite like Demeter's, for her domain was not separate from the mortal world but intimately woven into every aspect of mortal life. When she first walked among humans, Demeter found them living like clever animals, gathering what grew wild, hunting what they could catch, but never understanding that they could partner with the earth itself to create abundance beyond their wildest dreams. They knew enough to avoid poisonous berries, to follow animal tracks to water, to seek shelter from storms, but the secret of cultivation, of working with seed and soil and season, remained hidden from them. The goddess watched these early humans with the tender patience of a mother observing children who have not yet learned to walk. She saw their struggles, their hunger during the long months when wild food was scarce, their wonder when they stumbled upon groves heavy with fruit or clearings bright with edible roots. They were resourceful and brave, these mortals, but they were also vulnerable in ways that touched her divine heart. Her first gift to humanity was not the complex art of agriculture, but something simpler and more immediate, the blessing of wild abundance. Wherever Demeter walked, the forests grew richer with food, the meadows more generous with their offerings. Nut trees bent their branches lower, fruit trees bore twice their usual harvest, and even the humblest weeds became more nourishing when touched by her divine presence. But this passive blessing, generous though it was, could not satisfy Demeter's deeper understanding of what was possible. She had learned, during her long imprisonment, that the most profound growth comes not from receiving gifts without effort, but from participating in the sacred partnership between intention and care, between hope and patient work. She wanted to offer humanity not just abundance, but the knowledge that would make them partners in creation itself. The opportunity came when she encountered a small tribe living beside a river that flooded regularly, depositing rich dark soil across the surrounding plains. The people there were clever enough to have noticed that certain plants grew more abundantly in this flooded earth, but they had not yet made the leap to understanding that they could deliberately plant seeds in such soil and tend them to harvest. Demeter appeared to them not in her full divine glory, which might have frightened them into worshipful passivity, but in the form of an old woman who knew much about plants and soil, someone who could teach without overwhelming. She called herself Doso, and asked only for shelter and a place by their fire in exchange for sharing what she knew about making the earth more generous. The lessons she taught were simple ones at first. She showed them how to recognize the seeds within the wild grains they gathered, how to save the best specimens instead of eating them all, how to prepare small plots of ground by clearing away competing plants and loosening the soil. Her weathered hands demonstrated the gentle art of placing seeds at just the right depth, of spacing them so each would have room to grow, of recognizing the signs that told when the earth was ready for planting. But more than technique, Demeter taught these first farmers about relationship. She helped them understand that the earth was not just a resource to be exploited, but a living partner that would respond generously to care and attention. She showed them how to read the subtle signals that indicated when soil needed rest, when plants required more water, when pests threatened the growing crops, and how to address such challenges without destroying the delicate balance of the whole system. The first harvest that resulted from these lessons was modest by divine standards, but to the mortals who had planted those first deliberate seeds, it seemed like a miracle. To see grain growing where they had placed it, to watch tiny seeds transform into plants heavy with food, to understand that their own hands and knowledge had participated in this transformation, filled them with a joy that was almost religious in its intensity. And indeed, as word of these successful experiments spread to other tribes, humanity began to develop the first rituals of thanksgiving, the first ceremonies designed to honor the mysterious forces that made cultivation possible. They did not yet know that Doso the teacher was actually Demeter the goddess, but they understood that something sacred was involved in the process of making food grow from earth and seed in human care. Demeter, watching these early agricultural ceremonies, felt a satisfaction deeper than any she had experienced during the grand celebrations on Olympus. Here was worship that was not based on fear or the hope of receiving favors, but on genuine gratitude for a partnership that enriched both divine and mortal participants. The humans brought their careful attention and patient work. She provided the underlying life force that transformed seed into harvest, and together they created abundance that served the highest good of all. As the seasons turned and the knowledge of farming spread across the ancient world, Demeter began to understand her true role in the cosmic order. She was not just the goddess who made things grow, but the divine principle that governed all forms of reciprocal relationship. All partnerships where giving and receiving created something greater than either party could achieve alone. This understanding deepened when she began to experience the cycles of the agricultural year not just as external phenomena, but as rhythms that echoed in her own divine nature. Spring was not just the time when she helped seeds sprout, but the season when her own divine energy was most vibrant and creative. Summer was her time of nurturing and tending, when her attention was focused on guiding growth toward fullness. Autumn brought the joy of harvest, but also the first whispers of rest, the recognition that even divine energy needed periods of gathering in and restoration. And winter, when she first experienced it fully, taught her lessons she had not expected. As the earth rested beneath snow and the growing things withdrew their energy into root and seed, Demeter discovered that her own divine nature also needed this rhythm of dormancy and renewal. She learned to appreciate the quiet months not as emptiness but as the deep rest that made spring's abundance possible. The mortals, too, began to understand these rhythms, organizing their lives around the sacred calendar of planting and harvest. They developed festivals to mark the turning of the seasons, ceremonies to ask for Demeter's blessing on their seeds, rituals of thanksgiving when the harvest was safely gathered. In their careful attention to these cycles, they began to live in harmony with forces much larger than their individual lives, finding security not in trying to control nature but in learning to dance with its rhythms. But perhaps the most beautiful development in these early years was the way farming communities began to understand abundance not as something to be hoarded, but as something that increased when shared. Demeter's blessing seemed to flow most freely to those who were generous with their harvests, who saved seed not just for their own future planting but to give to neighbors whose crops had failed, who understood that the security of one farm was connected to the well-being of the entire community. Sleep now, gentle traveler, and dream of those first farmers discovering the joy of partnership with the earth, of seeds planted with hope and tended with care growing into harvests that fed not just bodies but souls. Rest knowing that this ancient covenant between human hands and divine blessing continues in every garden, every farm, every place where people choose to work with rather than against the rhythms of the natural world. Tomorrow, or perhaps in another dream, we'll follow Demeter as her understanding of abundance deepens, as she learns that even goddesses must sometimes face loss and grief, that the greatest gifts often come through the hardest lessons. The moon rises softly tonight, dear listener, casting silver light on sleeping gardens, and in this gentle glow we continue our journey with Demeter, no longer just the teacher of agriculture, but now a goddess who has discovered that the deepest joys, and sometimes the greatest sorrows, come from love that transforms the very foundations of who we are. Close your eyes and breathe slowly, letting these words carry you toward that most precious chapter in Demeter's tale, when she learned that even divine hearts can expand beyond their own understanding, when she discovered what it means to love someone so completely that their happiness becomes more important than your own. Years had passed since Demeter first taught mortals the secrets of cultivation, years during which the earth had grown more abundant and beautiful with each turning season. Her temples dotted the landscape like flowers, each one surrounded by fields that testified to her generous care. The mortals who tended these sacred groves had developed rituals of such beauty that even the other gods would sometimes pause in their celestial duties to watch the harvest festivals, the ceremonies of thanksgiving that rose like fragrant smoke toward Olympus. But for all the satisfaction Demeter found in her role as goddess of the growing earth, there was something missing from her divine existence, something that even the worship of grateful mortals could not provide. She had learned to nurture the earth and all its creatures, but she had never experienced the particular joy of caring for someone who belonged to her alone, someone she could love not as a goddess loves her domain, but as a mother loves a child. The answer to this longing came from Zeus himself, though whether it was his gift or simply divine destiny fulfilling itself, none could say. Perhaps it was both, as is often the case with the mysterious workings of cosmic law. For Zeus approached his sister with a proposition that surprised them both in its simplicity, in its recognition of what Demeter truly needed to complete her divine nature. He suggested that she might wish to have a daughter, someone who could inherit her gifts while developing her own unique understanding of what it meant to be divine. Not a creation of magic or divine decree, but a child born of love and intention, someone who would grow and change and surprise her parents with the wonderful unpredictability that makes mortal existence so precious, even when experienced by immortal beings. Demeter's heart responded to this possibility with a joy so intense it made wildflowers bloom instantaneously across 3 continents, made fruit trees bend low with sudden abundance, made even the stones crack open to release springs of sweet water. Yes, she wanted this more than she had wanted anything since her liberation from Kronos' darkness, wanted it with the same deep certainty that told seeds when to sprout and crops when to ripen. The child who was born from this divine union was named Persephone, and from her first breath she was unlike any being the cosmos had yet produced. She carried within her Demeter's gift for making things grow, but also something uniquely her own, a quality that seemed to embody the very essence of spring itself, the irrepressible joy that comes when life returns after the long sleep of winter. Where Demeter's presence brought steady abundance, Persephone's touch awakened the earth to celebration. Flowers bloomed more brightly around her, birds sang more sweetly when she passed, and even the shyest woodland creatures would emerge from their hiding places to bask in the gentle radiance that seemed to emanate from her divine young heart. As Persephone grew from infant to child to young maiden, Demeter discovered depths of love she had never imagined possible. Every moment of her daughter's development filled her with wonder, from the first time Persephone made a flower bloom simply by looking at it with curiosity, to the day she learned to call rain clouds to water a withering garden, to the afternoon when she first laughed with such pure delight that cherry trees burst into blossom out of season. But perhaps what touched Demeter most deeply was Persephone's compassion, her instinctive understanding that her gifts were meant to serve not herself but the world around her. The young goddess would spend hours tending sick animals back to health, would whisper encouragement to struggling seedlings, would sit for entire afternoons beside elderly mortals who had worked the fields all their lives, listening to their stories and honoring their accumulated wisdom. In Persephone, Demeter saw everything she had hoped to give the world reflected back with the fresh perspective of youth, seasoned with a sweetness that was entirely the child's own. Watching her daughter discover her powers, develop her own relationship with the growing earth, create new forms of beauty that had never existed before, gave Demeter a happiness so complete it seemed to justify every sorrow she had ever endured. Their life together was like an eternal spring, each day bringing new wonders, new shared discoveries about the mysteries of growth and abundance. They would walk together through forests that responded to their combined presence with such exuberant flowering that the very air seemed to shimmer with perfume and color. They would tend sacred groves where every tree bore fruit year-round, where streams ran sweet as honey and the grass grew soft as silk beneath their feet. Persephone's favorite place was a meadow in Sicily that had become sacred to both goddesses, a place where the flowers grew in patterns so beautiful they seemed like living poetry, where the light fell through the leaves in ways that made even ordinary moments feel touched by magic. It was here that she would come to gather flowers for the temples, here that she felt most connected to the earth that loved her, here that she was happiest and most herself. Demeter would often watch her daughter from a distance during these flower-gathering expeditions, marveling at the grace with which Persephone moved through the landscape, the gentle reverence she showed even to the humblest blossom. The young goddess had inherited her mother's power over growing things, but she had developed her own unique relationship with beauty itself, understanding that abundance meant not just enough food to sustain life, but enough loveliness to sustain the soul. The other gods, too, came to love Persephone, drawn by her combination of divine power and mortal-like curiosity, her ability to find wonder in things they had long taken for granted. Apollo would compose songs in her honor, celebrating the way her laughter could make even winter days feel warm. Artemis would invite her to hunt in the sacred forests, not for prey but for the perfect flower, the most beautiful vista, the hidden grove where deer came to drink from crystal streams. Even stern Athena would soften in Persephone's presence, allowing herself to remember what it felt like to discover something for the first time, to see the world through eyes that had not yet learned to categorize and analyze everything they encountered. In the young goddess's company, wisdom itself seemed to become more flexible, more open to possibilities that had not yet been explored. But it was with her mother that Persephone shared her deepest joy, the perfect understanding that comes between two beings who love the same things for the same reasons. They would spend entire seasons together, traveling to distant lands to bless the fields of mortals who had particularly pleased them, or simply wandering through wilderness areas where no human had ever set foot, delighting in the private beauty that existed solely for its own sake. These were the golden years, when mother and daughter existed in perfect harmony, when their combined presence made the earth more abundant than it had ever been, when their shared laughter could be heard in the rustle of wind through grain fields, in the gentle murmur of streams carrying snowmelt to waiting gardens. It was a time of such happiness that even the concept of sorrow seemed foreign, unnecessary, impossible to imagine. Demeter had found her completeness in loving and being loved by Persephone, had discovered that her divine nature was fulfilled not just through serving the world, but through cherishing someone who made every act of service feel like celebration. She was no longer just the goddess of agriculture, but the mother of spring itself, the protector of a love so pure it seemed to sanctify everything it touched. Sleep now, gentle traveler, and dream of that golden time when love seemed strong enough to protect everything it cherished, when the world was abundant with both harvest and happiness. when mother and daughter walked hand in hand through meadows that bloomed eternal in the warmth of their shared affection. Rest peacefully, knowing that such love, once given, becomes part of the eternal fabric of things, enduring even through the changes that tomorrow's tale will bring, shining like a constant star through whatever darkness the turning seasons might reveal. The night grows still around us now, dear listener, and in this quiet hour we must journey toward the darker chapters of Demeter's tale, toward the moment when even goddesses learn that love, no matter how pure, cannot always protect what we hold most precious from the larger mysteries of fate and cosmic necessity. Breathe gently as we approach this difficult passage. Let these words carry you through the storm toward the understanding that waits beyond it, the wisdom that can only be gained by traveling through loss toward a deeper comprehension of what endures. It began, as such stories often do, on a day that seemed no different from countless others, a bright morning in early spring when Persephone set out for her beloved meadow in Sicily to gather flowers for the upcoming festival of new growth. The earth was awakening from winter's rest, responding to her presence with the eager joy that had become as familiar as breathing to both mother and daughter. Demeter watched her go with the peaceful satisfaction of a mother whose child has grown into exactly who she was meant to be, a young goddess so perfectly in harmony with her divine nature that even the simplest actions seemed touched with grace. There was no premonition, no divine warning of what was to come, only the ordinary contentment of love that feels secure in its own permanence. In the meadow, Persephone moved among the flowers like a living poem, selecting blossoms not just for their beauty but for their meaning. Their ability to tell the story of spring's return in a language that mortals and immortals alike could understand. She gathered white lilies for purity, golden daffodils for rebirth, purple crocuses for the courage required to push through winter's last resistance into the warming air of the new season. It was while reaching for a particularly magnificent narcissus that grew apart from the others, its petals seeming to glow with their own inner light, that the earth beneath her feet suddenly cracked open. From the depths rose a chariot of black obsidian pulled by horses whose eyes burned like coals, and seated upon that dark throne was Hades himself, lord of the underworld, his gaze fixed upon Persephone with an intensity that spoke of longing held too long in check. The abduction happened with the terrible swiftness of nightmare, too fast for resistance, too sudden for escape. One moment Persephone was reaching for a flower in her beloved meadow. The next she was being carried down through the earth itself into realms of darkness she had never imagined existed. Her cries echoed through the underground passages until they faded into the kind of silence that swallows hope itself. Above, the earth closed again as if nothing had happened, leaving only the scattered flowers to mark where she had been, and the terrible absence that began to spread outward from that place like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. Demeter felt her daughter's disappearance as a physical wound, a tearing in the fabric of her divine being that left her gasping with pain she had never known was possible. The connection between them had been so complete that Persephone's terror became her terror, her daughter's desperate confusion her own bewildering anguish. In an instant, the secure world they had built together crumbled into a chaos of fear and disbelief. The goddess's first response was to search, traveling with desperate speed to every place she could imagine her daughter might have gone. She questioned every creature she encountered, every tree and stream and stone, demanding to know what they had seen, what they knew of Persephone's fate. But the earth itself seemed to have been struck dumb, unable or unwilling to reveal the secret of what had happened in that flower-strewn meadow. As hours turned to days without any trace of her beloved child, Demeter's grief began to manifest in ways that shook the very foundations of the natural world. The flowers in her sacred groves withered and died, their vibrant colors fading to brown and gray. The grain in the fields stopped growing, hanging limp and lifeless despite the warm spring air. Trees that had been preparing to unfurl new leaves instead began to shed the ones they had, as if autumn had come out of season to match the goddess's despair. Still she searched, traveling to every corner of the earth, calling Persephone's name until her voice grew hoarse, following every rumor, every whispered hint that might lead to her daughter's whereabouts. She disguised herself as a mortal woman, an old nurse seeking news of a lost child, hoping that in human form she might learn something that had been hidden from her divine perception. The mortals who encountered her during this time were puzzled by the strangeness that seemed to follow in her wake. Crops failed without explanation, springs ran dry, the very soil seemed to lose its ability to nourish the seeds planted in it. But they did not yet understand that they were witnessing the grief of the goddess who had given them agriculture itself, that her personal anguish was unraveling the careful work of centuries. It was during her wandering in Attica that Demeter finally received the first clue to her daughter's fate. Helios, the sun god who sees all that happens beneath his blazing chariot, took pity on her suffering and revealed the truth she had been seeking. Persephone had been taken by Hades to be his queen in the underworld, carried off with the permission, if not the active blessing, of Zeus himself. The revelation hit Demeter like a thunderbolt, not just because of what it told her about Persephone's location, but because of what it revealed about the cosmic forces that had conspired to steal her daughter. This was not some random act of violence, but a calculated decision made by the gods themselves, a political arrangement that treated her beloved child like a piece to be moved on some vast divine chessboard. Her grief transformed into something harder and more dangerous, a rage that made earthquakes seem gentle by comparison. If the gods had decided to take her daughter without consulting her, if they believed they could arrange the fate of the being she loved most without considering her feelings or rights as a mother, then they would learn what it meant to face the full fury of the earth itself. Demeter's withdrawal from her divine duties was immediate and absolute. She abandoned her temples, her sacred groves, her carefully tended relationship with the mortals who depended on her blessing. The earth began to fail in ways that had never been seen before, not the temporary setbacks of drought or storm, but a fundamental rejection of the very idea of growth and abundance. The grain withered in the fields, the fruit rotted on the trees before it could ripen, the vegetables in mortal gardens turned black and inedible overnight. Animals began to sicken and die, not from any disease but from the simple absence of the divine force that had always sustained the natural world. The very grass ceased to grow, leaving vast expanses of bare earth that cracked and hardened under the indifferent sun. This was not the mere tantrum of a spoiled goddess, but the logical consequence of removing the principle of nurturing love from the natural order. Without Demeter's willing participation, the earth could not sustain life, could not provide the abundance that mortals had come to take for granted. The complex systems that supported civilization began to collapse as the fundamental partnership between divine blessing and human effort dissolved into mutual recrimination and despair. Zeus, watching from Olympus as the mortal world began to wither and die, understood that he faced a crisis unlike any he had encountered before. This was not a war that could be won with thunderbolts, not a rebellion that could be crushed with superior force. This was the revolt of love itself, the refusal of the nurturing principle to participate in a cosmos that would treat its most precious relationships as mere political conveniences. Sleep now, gentle traveler, and let the weight of this sorrow settle into dreams that prepare you for tomorrow's revelations. For we have reached the heart of darkness in our tale, but darkness, as Demeter would learn, is not the end of the story but the place where new forms of understanding are born. Rest knowing that even in the deepest winter of the soul, spring waits patiently for its moment to return, that love, once given, changes the very structure of reality in ways that cannot be undone by any earthly power. The night grows deep and quiet now, gentle soul, and in this contemplative hour we walk with Demeter through the longest winter of her divine existence, the season when she learned that sometimes the only path to healing leads first through the heart of despair, through territories of the soul that cannot be mapped by wisdom alone. Let your breathing slow and steady, matching the rhythm of these words as they carry you through this difficult passage, and trust that even in the darkest chapters of any story, love continues its patient work, transforming what seems like ending into the possibility of new beginning. The famine that followed Demeter's withdrawal from her divine duties was unlike anything the world had ever experienced. This was not the temporary hardship of drought or flood, challenges that could be overcome with patience and ingenuity, but the fundamental failure of the earth itself to support life. Without the goddess's blessing, the most basic processes of growth simply ceased to function. Mortals who had spent their entire lives working the soil found themselves facing fields that would not yield, no matter how carefully they were tended. Seeds that had been saved from previous harvests refused to sprout, even when planted in earth that had once been rich and fertile. The fruit trees that had provided abundance for generations stood barren, their branches reaching toward a sky that seemed to have forgotten how to bless the earth below. But perhaps more heartbreaking than the visible signs of agricultural failure was the way hope itself began to wither. Children who had never known hunger started to grow thin and listless, their laughter fading as their families faced the unthinkable prospect of starvation. Communities that had been bound together by shared abundance began to fracture under the pressure of scarcity, as neighbors who had once helped each other through difficult seasons now guarded their dwindling stores with desperate jealousy. Demeter, wandering the earth in her mortal disguise, witnessed all of this suffering with a heart torn between grief for her lost daughter and guilt for the role her own anguish was playing in the world's destruction. She had not intended to punish innocent mortals for the crimes of the gods, but in her pain she had withdrawn the very essence of life itself, leaving the world to face consequences she had never imagined. Yet even in her darkest moments, when the weight of both personal loss and cosmic responsibility threatened to crush her divine spirit entirely, Demeter could not bring herself to restore the earth's abundance. To do so would be to accept Persephone's fate, to signal to Zeus and the other gods that their betrayal carried no real consequences, that the bonds of love and trust could be broken whenever it served their political convenience. It was during this time of wandering that Demeter found herself in Eleusis, a small town whose people were known for their kindness to strangers and their deep reverence for the mysteries of life and death. She came there not seeking anything in particular, but simply because her aimless grief had carried her to their gates, another old woman in need of shelter from the storms that raged both in the sky and in her heart. The royal family of Eleusis, King Celeus and Queen Metanira, welcomed her without question, offering her a place in their household as nurse to their infant son, Demephon. They called her Doso as she had before, and asked no questions about her past, sensing perhaps that she carried sorrows too deep for casual conversation. In caring for the mortal child, Demeter found a bittersweet echo of the happiness she had known with Persephone. Demephon responded to her divine presence with the innocent joy that only the very young possess, smiling when she entered the room, reaching for her with tiny hands that seemed to recognize something special about his mysterious nurse. Moved by the child's trust and his family's kindness, Demeter began to consider a gift that would honor their generosity while perhaps providing some meaning to her own suffering. She decided to make Demophon immortal, to transform this mortal infant into a being who would never know death or separation, who would remain forever young and beautiful and loved. Night after night, when the household slept, Demeter would hold the baby over the sacred fire, burning away his mortal nature bit by bit, replacing it with divine essence that would grant him eternal life. The process was slow and careful, requiring patience and absolute concentration, but it gave her something to focus on besides her own pain, a way to create rather than destroy. But mortal understanding, even when filled with love, could not always comprehend divine methods. Queen Metanira, rising one night to check on her son, discovered what appeared to be her baby being held over flames by the mysterious nurse. Her scream of terror and accusation shattered the delicate work of transformation, preventing Demophon from achieving the immortality that had been so nearly within his grasp. In her grief and rage at this interruption, Demeter revealed her true identity, her divine nature blazing forth with such power that the very walls of the palace trembled. She spoke of what she had been trying to give their son, of the gift that mortal fear had destroyed, of the way suspicion and misunderstanding could ruin even the most generous intentions. But even in her anger, Demeter recognized the love that had motivated the queen's actions, the maternal instinct that would risk anything to protect a child from perceived danger. In that recognition, something shifted in her understanding of her own situation, a dawning awareness that perhaps the cosmic forces that had taken Persephone were not motivated by cruelty, but by a kind of love she had not yet learned to comprehend. As compensation for the immortality that Demophon could no longer receive, Demeter established the Eleusinian mysteries, sacred rites that would teach mortals the deeper truths about life, death, and rebirth. These ceremonies would offer something even more valuable than endless life, the understanding that love and connection transcend physical existence, that separation is not the same as loss, that what seems like ending often marks the beginning of transformation. The mysteries she taught spoke of the great cycle that governs all existence, the way that death leads to new life, that winter makes spring possible, that even the most devastating loss can become the foundation for a deeper understanding of what truly endures. Through these teachings, mortals would learn to face their own mortality not with terror but with the peace that comes from understanding their place in the larger pattern of cosmic renewal. But even as she established these sacred rites, even as she began to glimpse the possibility that her suffering might serve a purpose larger than her personal anguish, Demeter could not yet bring herself to end the famine that was destroying the world. The knowledge of what lay beyond loss was not the same as the willingness to accept loss itself, and until she found a way to live with Persephone's absence, the earth would remain barren and lifeless. Zeus, watching from Olympus as both the mortal world and his sister's divine nature withered under the weight of unresolved grief, began to understand that this crisis could not be solved through command or compromise. This was not a political problem but a spiritual one, requiring not the exercise of authority but the discovery of a truth that could honor both love and the larger necessities of cosmic order. The solution, when it finally came, would require all parties to accept a different understanding of what love could mean, a recognition that sometimes the greatest devotion is expressed not through possession, but through willingness to share what we most treasure with forces greater than our individual desires. Sleep now, gentle traveler, and dream of mysteries that transform sorrow into wisdom, of love that learns to trust in patterns larger than its own understanding. Rest knowing that even in the deepest darkness, new forms of connection are being born. New ways of honoring what we cherish are waiting to be discovered. Tomorrow, or perhaps in another dream, we'll witness the resolution that teaches us all that some forms of love are so powerful they change the very structure of reality, creating new possibilities where once there seemed to be only loss. The stars begin their slow will toward dawn, gentle listener, and in their patient turning we find the rhythm for this penultimate chapter, where the greatest conflicts find resolution not through victory or defeat, but through wisdom that honors all the love involved, all the legitimate needs that seemed impossible to reconcile. Let your breath match the quiet cadence of these words, steady and hopeful, as we approach the moment when even gods must learn that some problems cannot be solved but can be transformed, can be alchemized into something that serves a larger purpose than any single desire, no matter how pure. The crisis had reached a point where even Zeus, master of the thunderbolt and ruler of the cosmic order, found himself facing the limits of divine authority. The earth lay barren and dying, mortals were perishing by the thousands, and his sister's grief showed no signs of abating despite his attempts at negotiation and command. This was not a rebellion that could be crushed or a political dispute that could be resolved through compromise, but something far more fundamental. For the first time in his reign as king of the gods, Zeus confronted a situation where raw power was not only useless but counterproductive. Every attempt to force a solution only deepened Demeter's resolve, only strengthened her determination to make the cosmos understand that love cannot be treated as a mere political convenience, that the bonds between mother and child are sacred beyond any earthly consideration. It was Hermes who finally suggested the approach that would break the deadlock, though whether his insight came from divine wisdom or simple diplomatic experience, none could say. He proposed that Zeus send him to the underworld not as a conqueror or negotiator, but as a messenger seeking to understand what Hades himself truly wanted from this arrangement, what he hoped to achieve through his marriage to Persephone. The journey to the realm of the dead was sobering for Hermes, who had always been more comfortable in the bright spaces of the upper world than in the shadowy depths where Hades ruled. But what he found there was not the grim kingdom of torment that popular imagination might suggest, but a realm of quiet dignity, where the dead found peace and Hades ruled with a justice that was stern but never cruel. Persephone herself was the greatest surprise, for Hermes had expected to find a captive princess pining for release, a victim mourning her lost freedom and desperate to return to her mother's embrace. Instead, he discovered a young goddess who had undergone a profound transformation, who had grown into her role as queen of the underworld with a maturity and wisdom that seemed to have aged her beyond her years. She spoke of her initial terror and grief, of the homesickness that had nearly driven her to despair during her first weeks in the underworld. But she also described how gradually, slowly, she had begun to understand that this dark realm needed her in ways that the bright world above never had. Here were souls who required comfort in their transition from life to death, spirits who needed guidance in navigating the mysterious territories of the afterlife. In serving them, in learning to be their queen and advocate, Persephone had discovered aspects of herself that had remained dormant during her carefree days in the upper world. She had developed a strength that came not from the power to make flowers bloom, but from the ability to ease the fears of those facing the ultimate unknown. She had learned compassion that was deeper than sympathy, wisdom that came from looking directly into the face of mortality and finding there not horror but profound meaning. Most remarkably, she had begun to love Hades himself, not through any supernatural compulsion or Stockholm syndrome, but through the gradual recognition of his essential character. Beneath his stern exterior, she had found a God who carried the weight of everyone's final destination, who provided order and justice in the one realm where mortals most needed to believe that such things existed. Their marriage had become real in ways that went far beyond the political arrangement Zeus had originally envisioned. They were partners in the truest sense, sharing the enormous responsibility of ruling the one kingdom that every mortal would eventually call home. Hades had found in Persephone not just a queen but a companion who understood the loneliness of his position, the isolation that came from being the god everyone feared to name. But Persephone also spoke of her love for her mother, of the deep longing she felt for the world of growing things, for the spring meadows and flower-filled groves that had shaped her earliest understanding of beauty and joy. She did not want to lose that connection, did not wish to abandon forever the realm where she had first learned to use her divine gifts in service of life and abundance. When Hermes brought this complex message back to Zeus, it became clear that the resolution would require a solution more nuanced than anyone had yet imagined. This was not a simple case of restoring stolen property or punishing wrongdoing, but a situation where legitimate needs and loves pulled in different directions, where any solution that completely satisfied one party would necessarily damage others. The compromise that Zeus finally proposed was as elegant as it was unprecedented in divine law. Persephone would spend part of each year with Hades as queen of the underworld, fulfilling her responsibilities to the dead and honoring the love she had found with her dark husband. But she would also return for part of each year to the world above, reuniting with her mother and restoring the earth's abundance through their combined presence. The specific arrangement was tied to the agricultural cycle that Demeter had taught to mortals, making divine law and natural rhythm mirror each other in perfect harmony. During the months when the earth needed to rest, when crops lay dormant and the soil gathered strength for the next growing season, Persephone would descend to rule beside Hades in the underworld. But when spring arrived, when the world was ready to burst forth in new growth, she would return to walk once more in her mother's footsteps across the awakening earth. This solution acknowledged that Persephone had indeed grown beyond the child she had once been, that her kidnapping, traumatic though it was, had revealed aspects of her divine nature that might never have emerged in the eternal spring of her earlier existence. She had become not just the goddess of flowers and growing things, but the divine bridge between life and death, the one who could move between the worlds and bring understanding to both. For Demeter, accepting this compromise required perhaps the greatest act of spiritual growth in her immortal existence. She had to release her understanding of love as possession, had to learn that truly caring for someone sometimes means allowing them to fulfill destinies that take them beyond our ability to protect or control them. But in return, she received something precious beyond measure: the promise that love, once given, never truly ends but simply transforms, taking new shapes that honor both growth and connection. Each spring, when Persephone returned to her embrace, would be sweeter for the separation that preceded it. Each autumn departure would be softened by the knowledge that it made the underworld itself more compassionate, more welcoming to the souls who must inevitably make that final journey. The moment of Persephone's first return was one of the most beautiful in all of mythological history. As she stepped from the dark passages that led up from Hades' realm, flowers burst into bloom beneath her feet, trees unfurled new leaves with almost audible sighs of relief, and the earth itself seemed to exhale with joy after holding its breath through the long months of winter. Demeter's reunion with her daughter was tender beyond words, a healing not just of their separation but of the understanding that had caused it. They embraced not as the mother and child they had been, but as the mature goddesses they had both become, each enriched by the experiences that had seemed to threaten their bond, but had actually deepened it beyond any previous imagining. Sleep now, gentle traveler, and dream of reunions that transform both parties, of love that learns to honor growth even when it leads through darkness, of compromises that serve not convenience but wisdom. Rest knowing that some solutions require not the victory of one side over another, but the patient work of finding arrangements that honor all the love involved. Tomorrow brings our final chapter, where we discover how this ancient resolution continues to bless the world, how the rhythm of separation and return that began in divine sorrow became the foundation for hope that endures through every season of the human heart. Dawn approaches softly now, dear listener, bringing with its gentle light the promise of new beginnings. And in this peaceful hour we complete our journey with Demeter, discovering how an ancient goddess's love transformed not just her own understanding, but the very rhythm by which the world continues to turn, season after season, in endless cycles of loss and renewal. Let these final words settle around you like morning dew on awakening gardens, and know that every spring that has ever come, every harvest that has ever fed hungry souls, carries within it the echo of this first great lesson in love that learns to let go while never truly releasing its hold. The resolution of Persephone's fate marked not just the end of the Great Famine, but the beginning of a new understanding of how divine love could serve the world. The compromise that had seemed so difficult to accept became the foundation for a rhythm that would govern not just the agricultural year, but the deeper patterns of hope and healing that sustain all life. Each spring, when Persephone returned from the underworld to walk once more beside her mother through awakening meadows, the earth responded with such joy that even the stones seemed to sing with gratitude. Flowers bloomed with colors more vivid than they had ever shown before, as if they were celebrating not just the return of warmth but the reunion of love that had learned to encompass both presence and absence, connection and growth. Demeter's joy at these reunions was deeper and more complex than the simple happiness she had known before her daughter's abduction. Now she understood that each moment of togetherness was precious precisely because it was not permanent, that the sweetness of spring came partly from the memory of winter's emptiness, that love's greatest gift might be its ability to transform even separation into a form of connection. During the months they spent together, mother and daughter worked side by side to restore the abundance that had been lost during the long famine. But their work now carried a different quality, informed by wisdom that had been earned through suffering. They blessed the fields not just with the power to grow, but with the understanding that all growth involves cycles of rest and renewal, that true abundance comes from working with natural rhythms rather than trying to force eternal productivity. The mortals who witnessed their combined presence during these seasons developed rituals and celebrations that honored not just the return of agricultural plenty, but the deeper truths about love and loss that Demeter's story had revealed. The festivals of spring became ceremonies of reunion, acknowledging that all the connections we cherish are made more precious by our awareness of their fragility. And when autumn came, when the time arrived for Persephone to return to her duties as queen of the underworld, the parting between mother and daughter became a sacred ceremony in itself. Demeter learned to release her beloved child not with the devastating grief that had once destroyed the world, but with a bittersweet blessing that honored both her love and her understanding of larger necessity. The earth's response to these partings was now as beautiful in its own way as its springtime celebrations. The leaves turned colors of gold and crimson that spoke not of death but of transformation. The final harvest came heavy with grain that would sustain life through the quiet months ahead, and even the first frosts carried a crystalline beauty that promised rest rather than destruction. winter itself was transformed by this new understanding. Instead of the barren wasteland that Demeter's first grief had created, the cold months became a time of quiet preparation, when the earth gathered strength for the next cycle of growth. Snow fell like a gentle blanket rather than a shroud, protecting sleeping seeds and providing the moisture that would feed spring's awakening. In the underworld, too, changes could be observed during Persephone's reign. Her presence brought a warmth to those shadowy realms that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with compassion. The souls who made their final journey to Hades' kingdom found not the grim judgment they had feared, but a queen who understood both the beauty of life and the mystery of what lay beyond it. Persephone's dual nature, her ability to move between the worlds of the living and the dead, made her the perfect guide for those who struggled with their own transitions. She could speak to them of the growing seasons they had left behind while also helping them understand the different kind of peace that awaited them in the realm of shadows. Her love for both worlds made her the ideal bridge between them. Hades himself was transformed by the annual rhythm of his wife's departures and returns. During the months when she ruled beside him, he learned to appreciate the vitality she brought to his somber kingdom. During her absences, he developed a deeper understanding of longing and anticipation, emotions that had been foreign to his nature before he learned to love. The other gods, too, found themselves affected by the new rhythm that Demeter's story had established. They learned to appreciate the cycles of presence and absence in their own relationships, to understand that even divine connections could be enriched by patterns of separation and reunion. The rigid hierarchies of Olympus softened somewhat as the gods began to recognize the wisdom that could emerge from accepting rather than simply commanding. But perhaps the most profound change was in how mortals understood their own relationships with loss and renewal. The mystery religions that grew up around Demeter's story offered not just hope for agricultural abundance, but spiritual comfort for anyone facing separation from those they loved. The promise that Persephone returned each spring became a metaphor for all the ways that love transcends apparent ending. Young mothers found comfort in Demeter's example when their children grew up and left home, understanding that the love that had nurtured them remained real, even when expressed at a distance. Grieving families discovered that the rhythm of seasons offered a pattern for their own healing, teaching them that sorrow and joy could coexist, that remembrance could be a form of presence. The agricultural festivals that celebrated Demeter's gifts became occasions for communities to come together and acknowledge the full complexity of human experience. They honored not just the abundance of harvest, but the patience required for planting, not just the joy of reunion, but the strength needed to endure separation, not just the promise of spring, but the wisdom that could be learned during winter's quiet months. As the centuries passed and civilizations rose and fell, Demeter's story continued to offer its gentle teaching about the nature of love that serves something larger than itself. Her temples, built in sacred groves where the cycles of growth and rest could be observed in their natural setting, became places of pilgrimage for anyone seeking to understand how personal love could align with cosmic purpose. The priestesses who served in these temples developed rituals that helped individuals find their own rhythm of engagement and withdrawal, connection, and solitude. They taught that healthy relationships, whether with people or with life itself, required both the ability to embrace fully and the wisdom to release gracefully, both the courage to plant seeds and the patience to trust in their eventual flowering. Today, though her temples have crumbled and her festivals are no longer celebrated by name, Demeter's wisdom continues in every garden where someone plants seeds with hope, in every kitchen where the harvest is transformed into nourishment, in every heart that learns to love without possessing, to care without controlling, to trust in the return of what seems lost. Her presence can be felt in the patience of farmers who work with seasonal rhythms rather than against them, in the wisdom of parents who learn to support their children's growth even when it leads them far from home, in the faith of anyone who has planted something beautiful and waits for it to bloom in its own time. Sleep now, gentle traveler, and dream of eternal springs that return because they were allowed to depart, of harvests that satisfy because they were planted in hope rather than demand, of love that endures because it learned to honor both connection and growth. Rest knowing that every season of your own life, every cycle of loss and discovery, participates in the same sacred rhythm that Demeter first established in her grief and wisdom. The dawn breaks softly now, touching the earth with light that promises new growth, new possibilities, new chances to practice the kind of love that serves life itself. And somewhere in every seed that stirs in warming soil, in every flower that opens to greet the sun, in every heart that learns to trust in tomorrow's possibilities, the blessing of the harvest goddess continues, patient and eternal as the turning seasons themselves.